Thank you for joining today's roundtable to listen to, and I sincerely hope also to discuss and critique my work. The research I'm going to present is part of my doctoral study in applied linguistics, which I've recently defended at the National Institute of Education in Singapore. That is Singapore's National Teacher Education Institute, and it is part of Nanyang Technological University. In my study, as I mentioned,
Pavel, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to interrupt immediately to say, do you mean that you just got awarded it?
So I defended, I completed all the requirements, and I received an email from university that my name has been submitted for a signature of the provost. I'm just waiting for that actual degree scroll, but otherwise I'm done.
Congratulations. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Then. Well done.
Thank you. So in my study, as I mentioned in the roundtable abstract, I explored writing conventions through a hybrid lens of English for academic purposes, EAP for short, and LCT. I especially wanted to exploit LCT's potential for showing nuances between practices that fall within the same code quadrants. So the core of what I'm about to present draws on a quantitative methodology, and about half my talk will be devoted to methodology. And my main point, that is what you will hopefully take away from this presentation, is that engaging with LCT quantitatively is really helpful in getting at fine-grained differences between practices. And before I begin the presentation proper, as Kara said, if you feel lost, though I hope I will explain the study clearly enough so that I don't lose you, just jump in and ask questions. Okay, so the origins of the issues I've researched are in my teaching work at Nanyang Technological University, where I teach at the Earth Observatory of Singapore and the Asian School of the Environment. I've been doing that for about 10 years now. And when I started teaching writing to PhD students and research fellows from various subdisciplines of earth sciences, I knew that while most of my students were English as foreign language users, I could not offer them a typical foreign language teaching approach. Additionally, many PhD students that I met arrived from vastly different disciplinary backgrounds. For example, there were geologists, geography teachers, archaeologists, mathematicians, geophysicists, biologists, computer engineers, and so on. So for the majority, their PhD was, we can call it, a journey of socialization into a new disciplinary culture, and also into discovering conventions of how knowledge is made in their subdisciplines. I'll return to what I mean by socialization in about a minute or so. So in short, the students needed most help with effective communication within their new subfields. And so for inspiration how to help my students, I turned to the rather vast research on academic writing and disciplinarity in EAP. What I'm going to do next is just briefly, in very broad brushstrokes, contextualize research in EAP for those of you who are from other academic fields. And I'm also going to mention why LCT as a sociological approach is a helpful resource that can help applied linguistic research in looking for answers to language problems, since applied linguists themselves have recognized the limits of their research designs. So EAP's primary enterprise is description of academic language varieties. Such descriptions are most frequently centered on published research articles from numerous disciplines and subdisciplines. And the focus on writing and disciplinarity has actually persisted. It's been at the forefront of EAP research for the past 40 years. So just for an illustration, here's a screen grab from a research article published recently on bibliography of EAP. You can see that academic writing and disciplinarity have been among the top foci in the past 4 decades. The most directly relevant research for me in my situation would have, of course, been studies of research writing of earth scientists. Unfortunately, while the number of disciplines and subdisciplines studied in EAP is large, earth sciences have remained somewhat on the margin of interest, with really only a handful of studies focusing on geology and by a single person. EAP research has covered a range of linguistic, discursive, and rhetorical features. For example, you have papers published on the use of the passive voice, variation in disciplinary vocabulary, questions whether there is, in fact, some kind of common vocabulary that's used in many disciplines, evaluative construction, so there will be sentences like, or clauses like, we conclude that, the results suggest that, expressing authorial stance, expressions of reader engagement, self-promotion, or even information structure in various parts of the research article, introduction, methods, result, discussion, and so on. So how do all these research features that I've just gave you examples of relate to disciplinary socialization? Well, here I think all of you will be able to draw on personal experience. If we kind of agree that a huge part of doing any discipline is not only the kinds of problems that are investigated or what methods are employed and how results are interpreted, but crucially, in what ways interpretations will be written about, then new discourse community members need to know how to present and organize their findings in ways that will be meaningful for their disciplinary peers. One of the prominent figures in EAP, Ken Highland, described disciplinary writing as needing to meet two conditions. The first condition is adequacy, which means that propositions must be plausible and within the epistemological framework of a discipline. Adequacy can be demonstrated by using technical vocabulary or appropriate forms of argument, the choice of what is highlighted in the research paper, what is expressed with caution and what with conviction. The second condition is acceptability, which means that as a writer, you have to create a professionally acceptable persona, portray an appropriate attitude both to readers and to the information that's being discussed. Because through writing, members of a community will affirm or confirm the shared viewpoints in their community. And so if you're a newcomer to a discipline, then you're faced with the task of learning these conventions, and mostly tacitly. So I showed you earlier that research into writing conventions has remained a significant focus in EAP. And now, traditionally, the lenses through which this research has been done would have been investigated from genre perspective with the help of corpora. A corpus, you can think of a corpus as an electronic collection of examples of language. This collection is compiled to represent some kind of language variety and data for your studies. Most studies have just looked at text. Others also include interviewing writers about their choices. So it's called ethnography. Now, the various findings then led to formulations of classifications, or previous classifications of discourse features were expanded upon. Features were usually researched in terms of frequency, often per 1,000 or 10,000 running words, and linked to social practices, such as authorial presence and interaction with the audience. Alternatively, usage of various discourse features was generalized as practices within a particular scientific paradigm. So that's whether it's hard or soft fields or particular epistemology, such as positivism versus social constructivism. We can think of these kinds of interpretations as the functional variety, that is using different features or same features but in different proportions can be explained by the function of the discipline, the function that methodologies have, the function of the belief how knowledge is made have. But this prevalent, this genre corpus and ethnography, this prevalent methodological approach has led to calls for new or additional methodological lenses, even from other disciplines, to better deal with the complexity of writing. Let me just exemplify some of these calls. So these are like narrow range or just a canonical range of texts. Others will say writing is just too complex and we need more methods. Some of these calls were pretty critical. This was more than 15 years ago, where Guy Cook says that one reason for limiting oneself could also be kind of fear of exploring what is out there in other disciplines. And so this is where I saw an opportunity to bring in LCT. Perhaps I could add here that drawing on LCT went beyond just calls for new methodological lenses. Even within applied linguistics, there were other calls for new theoretical developments. If we think about applied linguistics as a field where you're looking at social practices, because language use is a social practice, right? So the focus is on a social phenomenon, right? We necessarily need to engage with social theory. So instead of just theorizing being kind of inward looking, angled towards language, theorization or inquiry in applied linguistics should be more grounded really in social issues. And while some pioneering attempts were made, usually through complex dynamic system theory, another approach that I saw, and that has been used rather little in applied linguistics, is engagement with realist social theory. And this is the path that I took by engaging with social realism via legitimation code theory. So with LCT as my overarching theoretical framework, I wanted to find an answer to kind of an overarching general question about whether, if we look at how language features are used in published articles, what this can reveal to us about the principles on which knowledge is created in two sub-disciplines in earth science. So now we're coming to a point that all of you are familiar with, so I shall be rather concise here. LCT, of course, is a framework for researching knowledge and practices. Specifically, LCT aims to theorize knowledge by focusing on forms that knowledge and practices take, because the question here is, what if the shape of knowledge itself plays some role in the real world effects that knowledge has? LCT posits that practices are underpinned by multiple organizing principles. The organizing principles then generate the forms taken by specific sets of practices, and these characteristics of practices are then captured by codes. Or to put differently, LCT is structured in several dimensions, each with a set of concepts, with a dimension exploring a species of legitimation code. And in my study, I worked with the dimension of specialization. So specialization dimension conceptualized practices as knowledge knower structures that specialize or distinguish actors and discourses in different ways. And actors in discourses are not only positioned within knowledge knower structures, but establish different forms of relations. So we can then distinguish between epistemic relations to knowledge structures and social relations to knower structures. And of course, both concepts vary independently from stronger and weaker, and the different strength then reflect four main code modalities. All of you are familiar with this. So if knowledge epistemic relations are stronger, then we talk about knowledge code, social relations, knower code, both elite codes. And when both relations are weak, we talk about relativist code. So I'll now turn to methodology, where I will describe the two earth science subdisciplines I selected, the data I collected, and how, crucially, I translated between the data and LCT concept. By the way, how's everybody doing? Have I managed to keep you with me so far on this journey?
All good.
All good. Excellent.
Fine.
Hopefully you're not sleeping. All right. So let me very briefly talk about the two subdisciplines. So I aim to select subdisciplines whose internal organizing principles likely differed, since such a difference could then be reflected in how discourse features were used. I selected one subdiscipline which is based on chemistry and the other which is based on physics. So the one based on chemistry is called marine chemistry. It's concerned with tracing the journey of chemical elements from original source through the ocean to sediment deposition. At least that's the traditional focus on marine chemistry. The relatively new focus is understanding the impact of these chemical elements on the whole oceans and global climate. Seismology is concerned with Earth's tremors, which are generated by earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, but also explosions, such as nuclear tests. Seismologists focus both on present and past earthquakes in order to understand the evolution of fault systems, and this knowledge is, of course, key for understanding earthquake physics and estimating seismic hazards. What I find interesting about seismology is that in addition to observations or instrumental measurements in the field, seismology is underpinned by numerical modeling. You can think of it as equations. Think of it, actually, they are equations, because direct observation is very often limited. Processes, of course, take place deep inside the Earth's interior. And so seismological models are essentially simulations that lead to inferences and probabilistic causality. So once I had the subdisciplines, then it was time to construct my corpus. And so what I did was I collected 120 discussion and conclusion sections from experimental articles. Experimental meaning that there's methodology and results as opposed to like review articles or only methodological articles or only theoretical articles. The articles were published in a 5-year period. That was the latest 5-year period at the point when I started collecting my data in 2018. I focused on discussions and conclusions because it was there that I expected a high concentration of knowledge claims. So I've just mentioned knowledge claims, but how did I actually define knowledge claims? This was the first tricky question here, because defining knowledge claims has actually proved rather elusive. So firstly, there are differing conceptualizations proposed in the literature, and also what counts as a knowledge claim requires expert level familiarity with the discipline or subdiscipline you're studying. And I, of course, did not possess it. I did try, to confess, but my attempts to identify knowledge claims reliably just proved extremely challenging. So I decided to equate knowledge claims with propositions, which is a term that I borrowed from systemic functional linguistics. Okay, I'm going to be
what's a proposition?
Yeah, I'm going to be a bit technical here, so let me try to explain. So, so in systemic functional linguistics, clause functions as an exchange, and so as it fulfills two basic functions: clause and exchange. Giving is one, and demanding. So, what can be exchanged? It's either goods and services or information. And when information is at the center of exchange, then clauses are either in the form of statements to give information or questions to demand information. And so such clauses are propositions. So propositions, according to SFL, are statements giving or asking for information. My unit of analysis was a ranking clause. Again, according to systemic functional linguistics, the word clause refers to a grammatical unit which is centered on a verb, whereas the word sentence refers to orthography. So typically a sentence will start with a capital letter and finish with a full stop, but of course one orthographic sentence can consist of multiple clauses, right, which have a verb as an obligatory element. So what you can see here is that the number of clauses, number of sentences, marine chemistry articles are quite a bit longer than seismology articles. So this number of sentences, and each sentence had easily 2, 3, 4, 5 clauses. So I had to analyze anywhere between 10 and 20,000 individual clauses. I looked through, so to identify articles, I looked through various databases because Earth scientists like to publish in a range of journals which do not necessarily need to have.
Pavel?
Yes.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you for a second because I think what you've brought up just a moment ago is quite interesting, which is definitions of things like knowledge claims and knowledge practices. And I just think it's worth just taking a moment to think about that because it's not defined anywhere in LCT and never will be. Because what's knowledge is, it's really interesting. I think it's interesting because if you go to, I read mostly a lot of philosophy, and what knowledge is has been the subject of endless and pointless debate for 2,500, 3,000 years, and never gets anywhere because, as sociology points out, it is the subject of constant struggle over what is knowledge or not. So trying to define it is absolutely pointless. But in terms of a knowledge claim or anything that LCT can analyze, it can be anything written. So I think it's less that you're trying to define knowledge claims because that's anything that's done, said, or thought or whatever. It's more kind of you're trying to find just a unit in order to be able to kind of try and get your head around the way in which you want to enact the concepts, I think.
Right.
So that, by the way, freaks people out when they say, oh, you have to define, somehow you define, like knowledge before you can analyze it. And I'm like, you never can because it is the subject. That's not exactly what you're saying, but I'm using this as an excuse to talk about this for a moment, which is that people do worry about trying to define knowledge when knowledge is the thing that's the subject of argument. Penny, just jump in. Anybody just jump in.
But Carl, would you be happy with a grammatical definition that is a claim? Because SFL's always worrying about what can be argued about. So a clause gives you something to argue about.
It's more of a methodological issue at that point. And it's for the linguistic analysis, but LCT can. So one of the things that's interesting, I don't want to take Pavel too far off his track, but one of the things that's interesting is when there's a belief often from linguistics that you have to carve up a text first and then analyze which code each unit is. Whereas codes don't tend to restrict themselves to grammatical units. They tend to go wherever they are. So when I'm analyzing a text, it doesn't mean anybody else has to do it this way. There are many ways of, I don't want to say skinning a cat, that's awful. There are many ways of doing this stuff. That's less interesting than a metaphor. But anyway, there's many ways of doing this stuff. So for example, when I'm analyzing, a transcript, and this is by hand, so it's qualitative and very slow. I always find that codes don't ever sit inside any kind of neat unit regularly, but I'm often asked that, particularly in China. So it's like you've got to slice up the transcript, the data, whatever it is before, and then you assign values to the no, I'm not carving up the chicken. I'm a vegetarian, so no way. You've got to divide up something like an object of study and then assign values to all the bits. You don't have to do that because, and some people think that's the only way you can do it, but you don't have to do that because, as I said, codes don't fit neatly into those sorts of units. Codes will shift. Strengths of organizing principles will shift halfway through, like a clause or a sentence or something like that. So it just doesn't fit that way. But with linguists, they have a different set of things. So they have a different set of issues they're dealing with. So yeah, I just thought it'd be an interesting thing that there are many issues like that are not. So knowledge is not defined anywhere in LCT, and there is a reason for it. That's the reason why I mentioned it. But when you come to carve up your data, then there are all sorts of other reasons why you might want to make a specific decision, like you're doing. I just thought it was an interesting discussion for us to think about for a minute. We can always circle back to that, but I'll let you carry on.
All right. So let me now move on to how I kind of engaged with LCT. So characteristics or attributes of sets of practices can take myriad forms, and so the task I had in front of me was to select some discursive features established in EAP research and then combine them into sets that would match with LCT sets of concepts. And one difficulty was that, of course, many discursive features had been studied in isolation. That was one thing. Second thing, I had to create a coding scheme that would ideally draw on existing EAP classifications. And third, that scheme should allow quantification, since I wanted to engage with LCT quantitatively. So after a long search and experimentation, I settled on 4 features that expressed what I term the visibility of knowledge and knowers, and the authoritativeness of knowledge and knowers. And then the features describing visibility were then topical themes and citations, and those for authoritativeness were hedging and boosting, and first-person pronouns. Now, these features actually have been studied in EAP for these characteristics, that is, for visibility or authoritativeness of stances, and so they have discourse correlates in EAP research. So to operationalize epistemic relations, so I selected topical themes, and for visibility and hedging and boosting for authoritativeness. Of course, as a reminder, epistemic relations are concerned with the relationship between practices and objects of study. So the more prominent these specialized objects and procedures are in writing, the stronger epistemic relations are. So a theme can be considered, can be thought of as information that appears in the initial clause position. It could be the grammatical subject. That's the most common realization. It could be predicated or a verb. It could be some kind of complement or adjunct of time, place, manner, and so on. This initial position, according to systemic functional linguistics, carries significant in the message construction, since the writer has selected that theme as the starting point. So the theme is then the aboutness or the focus of the message. And so investigating the proportion of disciplinarily specific topical themes can hint at the degree to which the legitimate contribution necessitates disciplinary specificity. Hedging and boosting, of course, represent epistemic certainty of propositions. So in general, the more assuredly a claim is presented, the stronger epistemic relations can be considered. Now, if we move on to social relations, I selected citations and first-person pronouns. So again, as a reminder, social relations are concerned with the relationship between practices and their actors. So the more prominent actors are in disciplinary writing, the stronger social relations are. Citations, of course, attribution of propositional content to somebody else. This source can be then more prominent if represented by citations in subject position, so that the writer appears in the subject position of the sentence, or less prominent if it appears in parentheses or if the reference is just a superscripted number. First-person pronouns, of course, direct expression of authorial presence. In applied linguistics or in EAP, first-person pronouns have been partitioned into various roles, and each role being more authoritativeness or less authoritative. I will show you examples later on. So of course, the more authoritative the role is expressed by a personal pronoun, the stronger social relations can be considered. So I'm now going to present 4 scale clines for each of the 4 features, together with examples of my classifications. You will also see on the next 4 slides the specific research questions that I asked, because I have presented, of course, only the general question now, or by now. Okay, so we'll look at topical themes. So, as I've mentioned, if epistemic relations reflect focus on specialized objects of study and procedures, then the more prominent these specialized objects are, and the stronger epistemic relations are. I divided all topical themes into 4 categories. So ER +1 or ER++ were expressions that appeared in a list of terms that I compiled from 2 earth science dictionaries. Plus, of course, I had to use my judgment. So for instance, if the theme was the name of a very long chemical compound, which was not in the technical dictionary, because not all chemical compounds can be in the dictionary, I still judged it to be a sub-disciplinary specific theme. And then themes were categorized as ER +0.5 based on a new academic vocabulary list, which is a list of words that are common across many disciplines and are more common in academic texts rather than non-academic. Typical, the word is research, study, results. ER -0.5 were non-academic expressions. That is, they were not on the academic word list. And ER -1 is a shorter list of referential themes. Again, I had to I had to find some kind of methodological way around the complexities of language. I used 4-point scales, and this is common to all these operationalizations, not because 4 options represent all possible types that there are, but the categories that I selected, the 4 categories, were, the selection was done to suit the data in my corpus, and at the same time to keep the coding manageable. Importantly, the scales had to be equidistant, so you can see that there's a 0.5 distance between the categories, despite the fact that some of the 4 discourse features could have been coded on finer scales than others. But I think that selecting finer scales may be more suitable if you're studying individual features. But I was really trying to find a common denominator for the 4 features that I studied. Okay, so
sorry, Pavel, I think that's a really
yeah.
good point that you're making there, which is the temptation to draw a map as big as the country is always there, particularly because we're always feeling like we have sort of in our mind that kind of critical person on our shoulder, and also there's many fields are obsessed with describing and modeling rather than actually explaining, and so they kind of like there's a sense in which one can often be criticized for, oh, you haven't discussed either one of two things. You haven't discussed these features of the text. Well, there are endless features of the text or practice that could be discussed. And you know, the one can't do everything. And then because it's not relevant to the objective study, to the problem situation, the questions. Or they might say, well, we know that there are 52 categories of this, and you must use them all as if, you know, and that's a kind of like this sort of dogmatic application of a model, again ignoring the questions that you're asking of the problem that you've got. So I think it's really important that you did that, which is to say, look, you know, these are my questions, this is what I'm trying to do, this is the nature of the kind of data I'm looking at, and in order to reach this goal, these are the decisions that I have made along the way. You will always find that people, you know, question those, which is good, but there are always going to be some people who are going to be very doctrinal, very dogmatic about that there are 52,000 categories of this, or they'll be saying, but what about, I mean, you get this in classroom research as well, by the way, that people will say, like, what week of the semester was it that you were, the term that you were studying these kids? And well, what day of the week was that classroom? And was it before or after lunch? Because we know that kids are different before or after lunch, and you know, and that sort of stuff. And how warm was it in the classroom? All these endless variables, and then, you know, that make it almost impossible to generalize anything. And of course, the color of the walls, or, you know, the nature of the clothing that they were wearing, or whatever. You can go endlessly. And it is all about research is all a question of what we don't study more than what we do. In the same way that music is the space between the notes, it's like, it's what you don't do that's just as important as what you do. So I'm just like, that's not related exactly to it. I mean, I'm not criticizing you in any way. I'm just saying, you know, using what you're talking about to say it's a really good lesson for people who are doing this stuff to just make an argument about what you're doing rather than feel that you have to do everything.
I mean, my methodology is like 60 odd pages in the thesis, and there's a lot of messiness in the data that I had to deal with, right? And you just, at some point, you have to make a decision of, okay, no more of this, because otherwise you won't get anywhere, as you said. Yeah. All right. Right. So visibility, we looked at visibility of epistemic relations. Here, visibility of social relations. So I mentioned that that cited sources can range from highly visible to more or less obscured. So to classify citations based on visibility, I created my visibility cline by combining and modifying 3 existing EAP typologies. So so here are examples. From subject head noun to other positions. Then there were some in parenthetical clauses, and of course many were in parentheses. Superscripted citations are not really common, perhaps only in 2 articles in my whole corpus. Okay. All right, so now we're moving to authoritativeness. So hedges and boosters. They modify propositional stance by either weakening, that's hedges, or strengthening, that boosters, it's epistemic certainty. And to decide which specific expressions modify the strength of propositions, I compiled a list, though certainly not exhaustive, of expressions identified in 7 previous EAP studies. This list was, of course, just a guiding list with all expressions, with all the clauses examined in their context. That what it means is, if the word is on the list, I did not automatically code it based on that list. I really looked at whether the hedge or booster in that particular context matched what was on that list, and if not, then of course I deviated from that list. What you will also notice that some categories include the word modalizing booster or modalizing hedge. We can think of modalizing clauses, and there again got inspiration from systemic function linguistics, as a projecting or commenting clause, which will kind of signal the source, like we hypothesize that, or our results suggest that. I thought of them as frames, which means that they did not include the disciplinary content in its own right, but instead we can just think of them as like metaphors of probability and usuality. So like we believe that could be equated to possibly, or it is likely that could be equated to probably. And so these modalizers, of course, could also change the strength of authoritativeness, and they were, of course, useful especially for the 0.5 categories. And lastly, we look at personal pronouns. So some EAP studies have looked at personal and possessive pronouns, that is not only I, we, but also, for example, our or us. Others focus only on the pronouns of I and we. I made the choice of analyze only I and we, as well as words like author or authors in the subject position, if it was clear from context that the word author means the writer himself or herself. And that's because I and we is more directly responsible for what is happening in that sentence, whereas if you have sentences like our results confirm something, the word our is really just a modifier for the word results, where the actual core of the subject would be the word results. Now, I was not the only person who coded, of course, the data. You can see that I intercoded part of the data with another coder who was an associate professor in applied linguistics. These are the minimal kind of instances intercoded to reach measure of reliability of the coding scheme, which is called Cohen's kappa. How to understand the values of Cohen's kappa? You have got manual here. You can see that it should be at least 0.61, which we managed to get. But even then, even after we arrived at satisfactory intercoder agreement, I still several hundred instances, especially of hedging and boosting, that was tricky, and personal pronouns were still intercoded, where I was in doubt because the study was quantitative and I aimed for as precise numbers as I could get for my coding. All right. Now, I suppose all of you kind of know probably how I coded, but just to be sure. So the degrees of strength of relations to knowledge structures and to know structures can be infinite, of course. And so capturing these degrees opens endless possibilities for visualizing dominant codes, as well as within code differences. I contain the strength of relation within an interval from -1, the weakest possible, to +1, the strongest possible, to calculate the value somewhere within this interval for each of the features. So what I did was I first tallied the coded values. So for example, an example in marine chemistry article number 3, we had 125 topical themes, and I coded them into these 4 categories, then divided by 125, and I got 0.668, which is roughly there. Then did the same thing for citations. Again, after tallying, I got 0.8, which would roughly give you this position in the knowledge code quadrant. So I did this for the 120 articles. Ooh, okay, does anybody have any question about the methodology before I jump into the results? Everybody still with me? All right. So now the quantitative results. So I'm going to show you two plots. So this is for marine chemistry, with the red diamonds, that being the mean value for all 60 articles. So in marine chemistry, more than 3/4 of the corpus articles are positioned within a rather small area of ER plus 0.5 to ER plus 1. You can see my mouth, so this is roughly here, and SR minus 0.5 to minus 1. So here you can see the concentration here, which signals substantial uniformity of practice. In comparison, in seismology, the profile is more diffuse, pointing to a greater flexibility of what counts as acceptable writing. Remember, all these are published text. More than half of the research articles are not positioned within the same smaller subquadrant, and that's largely as a result of increased author visibility. Especially the usage of parenthetical citation differed. So while parenthetical citation make up about 75% cases of all citations in 2/3 of marine chemistry articles, in seismology articles, it's only 1/3 of articles. So there are more non-parenthetical citations in seismology than in marine chemistry. Interestingly, both profiles will also stretch into the elite quadrant, although only 3 articles from marine chemistry versus 8 from seismology, showing that at times knowers are afforded more visible status in originating claims in seismology. If we look at authoritativeness, and I will again show you 2 plots. So here, authoritativeness in marine chemistry reflects mostly the elite code. Virtually all research articles are positioned on the ER axis between slightly above 0 and so it's neutral to 0.5 medium certainty. In seismology, again, the scatter along the ER axis is noticeable, with more articles positioned higher, so ER plus 5, more than ER plus 0.5, reflecting that seismology texts contain knowledge claims of a high degree of certainty or clauses of high degree of certainty. Again, less concentration and more flexibility is evident in seismology. Okay.
Excuse me, Pavel.
Yes.
Is there any convention? I'm wondering about the quantity of citations. Does either discipline, is it better if you have multiple citations within a parentheses? Are some articles more heavily supported with citations?
That's sorry, Penny. That's such a good question, isn't it? Because like you get like you read something like cultural studies or something, and you might find that there's like virtually none. But then you get like an SFL paper, and it'll go the brackets Halliday and 15 references, and then and close brackets purpose open brackets Martin 16 more references. So it's such a difference in some of the subjects I read. What about for you, Pavel?
So I did not, so some journals will limit the number of citations that you can have. They'll say, for example, maximum 50, right? Now, in my corpus, no such journal imposed limitations, right? And so as far as the number of citations goes, I think it really varies from author to author. I'll talk about I'll talk about the individual variation a bit on later on. And what I was interested in, of course, was what kinds of citations there were. So you can have a lot of citations, but if they are of the non-parenthetical type, right, then quantitatively it will reflect. Right?
Yeah. So the choice of how you handle it is not to do with conventions, but to do with how the argument's being rolled out. So it's very supportive of your method.
Right. Right. Now, while a big part of my study is quantitative, I also dabbed a bit into qualitative study, among other things, in my PhD. And so I'll now very briefly mention my qualitative explorations. So the quantitative results have placed both subdisciplines in the same quadrants, albeit within quadrant differences. And I was interested to see whether these differences could be further nuanced. And I drew on the 4K model, which dissects epistemic relations and social relations. And I utilized the epistemic relations portion of that model. So we know that epistemic relations are concerned with relations between practices and their objects of study. In the 4K model, epistemic relations are distinguished into ontic relations, that is, how strongly a discipline or a field of practice controls its legitimate objects of study, and discursive relations, that is, control over legitimate methods. Okay. Again, we have varying strength and and 4 code modalities. I'm sure you all are familiar with this. So what I did, because it was just an exploration, I investigated a subsample of topical themes. I randomly selected 50 orthographic sentences per subdiscipline, which yielded 60 ranking clauses in marine chemistry and 52 in seismology. And then I created 4-type classification of topical themes. So these are only the ER+1 topical themes. The object of study or occurring phenomenon, that was the absolutely most common topical theme. That's, of course, not surprising. Then there were a few themes dealing with the geographical location or time periods. Then research process, methods, instruments, and so on, and research products. What I found was that despite this small subsample, the themes, at least in the category of objects of study, pretty well represented the foci of the 2 subfields. That is, so here are some examples. In marine chemistry, the concern was with chemical elements and their circulation, concentration, interactions in the ocean, as well as how the elements are influenced by biological and physical processes. And in seismology, concern with earthquakes and physics of earthquakes, seismic waves, and natural hazards. So next, I considered themes about research method or approach together with the themes about research products, because I reasoned that many research product themes actually hint at ways that objects of study are investigated. So in marine chemistry, these kinds of themes that it's dealing with methods or products are actually twice less frequent than in seismology, which is interesting because you may remember that the sample for marine chemistry was actually larger. The subsample, there were 60 clauses versus 52. And what I found was that methods or research products in marine chemistry include more general procedures, like calculation or modeling or use of instrumental or geological records. That is, methods that are not really specific to marine chemistry, but could be used in biology or linguistics. Whereas in seismology, there were more sub-disciplinarily specific methods, such as seismic wave inversion, aftershock relocation, back projection, parametrization. So the higher specificity and frequency of research methods and product, despite the smaller subsample, suggests that visibility of methods may play a more important role compared to marine chemistry when discussing research findings in discussions and conclusion sections. So then what I did was I took the 4K model, and what they suggest that themes that in both subdisciplines, objects of study represent strong ontic relations, clearly separating the subdisciplinary objects of study, whereas themes expressing research processes are more specialized in seismology. And so I positioned marine chemistry in situational insight and seismology in the purist insight quadrant. Okay, now the most important question in all of science or inquiry, so what? Okay, why does that matter? So let me now recapitulate the main findings and try to formulate what the findings imply. So I started my inquiry with a question about earth science, just a discipline little explored in EAP, and I engaged with LCT specialization dimension, predominantly quantitatively, but also qualitatively, and I found that marine chemists present their specialist knowledge more visibly than seismologists, but seismology knowers figure more prominently than marine chemists. Knowledge in seismology is presented with a somewhat higher degree of certainty, but marine chemistry knowers are overall more authoritative. What are the implications of these quantitative findings? I would say first, my results do not support the notion, quite widespread in EAP, of impersonal empiricism that was set to describe the natural sciences. In fact, only 17% of my corpus articles do not feature any first-person pronoun, as compared to 24% featuring at least 11 instances. And here we're talking only about discussions and conclusions, not the complete articles. Even within the most common category, that's 2 to 10 personal instances, or instances of personal pronoun, which is almost 50% of the corpus. Okay, half of that will feature at least 6 instances. And in addition, the SR+1 and SR+0.5 are the most common roles in which authors feature themselves. If you're wondering whether the number of personal pronouns per article corresponds to the length of the text, not really, because even short text could include quite a few person pronouns. So there's no correlation with the length of the text. Second, EAP research into differences in discourse feature usage has tried to explain any found differences in terms of functional differences, that is by linking them to meaning-making practices. But what has been considered much less is the possibility that differences may be stylistic. And what my results show of within quadrant differences is that we can think of these as stylistic profiles. That is, rather than hinting at how disciplines do it, hinting more at the degrees of freedom that writers have within subdiscipline. Okay. Now, this stylistic variation has at least 2 pedagogical implications. Okay, number one is budding, in my case, seismologists or marine chemists can be less anxious about not writing like members of their academic tribe, because in fact, even where there are noticeable centrifugal tendencies, I mean, you might remember that I pointed in visibility at the concentration in marine chemistry within the smaller subquadrant. Even there, a stylistic range is quite apparent. So that's first implication. A second implication is that this variation shows that writers are not as constrained as we might believe if we accept the criticisms of those researchers who work within the more critical EAP perspective, that teaching students about current practices will only perpetuate the hegemony of established styles. Because what we can see that there really is not a hegemony of a particular style. And anyway, if you want to challenge any stylistic hegemony, you first anyway have to know what the hegemony is, if there is any. Number 4, many EAP studies looked at differences in single feature usage. I have worked on 2 pairs of features, but even then, we can argue that similarities exist, especially when it comes to comparing the median points. Those were the red diamonds, where you can't really distinguish writers from the 2 subdisciplines if you look at the median points. And so if you want to elicit differences between subdisciplines, we have to look at several features at the same time. Now, using Cartesian planes provides an alternative and arguably, at least in my case, much clearer view of the variation or similarities, rather than when results are presented in tables. And this will be typical for EAP results. So you will have only average numbers, which do not actually tell you too much about any underlying principles or the individual variations between disciplinary writers. So quantitative results, qualitative results, as I mentioned, the exploration put marine chemistry in the situational quadrant, whereas seismology, because of its larger emphasis on specialized methodology and products, in the purist quadrant. If I take my exploration more generally, or both of these quantitative and qualitative studies, what we can say is that the findings highlight that research at the level of subdisciplines is not only preferable to avoid rough generalizations, especially, as is common in EAP, findings from 2, 3, or 4 disciplines are taken to represent the whole area of what's called soft fields or hard fields, but that this is a rather blunt instrument, and that some features, such as first-person pronouns, typically should not be wholesale associated with some kind of epistemology, be that epistemology of hard fields, soft fields, or positivist or constructionist epistemology. In addition, studies that utilized LCT that I'm aware of have focused on determining the specialization code that underpins discipline, or on how specialization code changes with each discipline. But the fact that I have found 2 predominant codes in my study, so one for visibility where knowledge code predominated, and one for authoritativeness, that is where elite code predominated, shows that disciplines or subdisciplines may be underpinned by various specialization codes at the same time, and really depends on our lenses, or we need to specify the lenses that we use. That should go with what kind of code we find characterizes a discipline, because writing is hellishly complex, and if we find that one code underpins a particular discipline, we may just have we may have arrived at the false conclusion, because there may really be more than just one code. In fact, the same specialization codes that I found for the two subfields may be found to predominate in many disciplines if the same language codes are investigated. And so teasing out differences might be possible only if we compare within quadrant differences. And of course, if we use more fine-grained coding schemes. That brings me again to the main point that I hope you will take away, is that the quantitative engagement with LCT really helped me to tease out the differences between subfields, because often subfields are lumped into one field, and that does not represent the kind of code that predominates in a field. Thank you.
Thanks, Pavel. Anybody just jump in. Jump in and on the topic, related to it, thoughts that you've been inspired to have, or whatever.
I hope that people are not sleeping by now.
Andres is showing this is to the way, which is pretty impressive, because it must be 3:20 in the morning at this point. But I tell you what, then there's something that I'm really interested in, which is may not be of interest to other people, which is I really want to get a hold of a copy of this, because I'm actually interested in, at some point in the not too distant future, I need to write a chapter about specialization and planes. And one of the things I want to write about is distribution patterns, just briefly. So I'm going to have to get hold of a copy of this when it's done, or something like that, because
it's already been sent to the library, so I think I can send it to the LCT repository.
Yes, do send it to the to either the send it to the web team. So worldwide, I'm just going to write the email into the chat, please, and we will upload it. But yeah, because one of the things, so we've got things like pathways. So we've got these analytics in LCT. So we have pathways, movements around. And so actually it kind of goes, we've got like pathways, movements around, we've got profiles, which are movements, and we've got planes. Now, often planes have worked as a sort of really super simple, basic kind of visual aid while talking, you know, just to remind people that if you put up a plane and have something in the knowledge code, and then you put up a plane and have something else in the Noah code, that somehow helps in the multimedia, you know, in a kind of multimodal kind of way. And so there's something about that that kind of just gives people another way of thinking. But it really doesn't say much that you couldn't convey by words, particularly in a printed format, where people get a chance to you know, see the difference between those words and other words and so on, and keep track of these things. But when we actually see something like a distribution pattern, or you know, like say for example, the quantitative work on based upon the big surveys in New South Wales a few years ago, where you could see that, say, psychology and natural science were both viewed as knowledge codes by teachers in New South Wales, but that concealed the fact that, so no, it wasn't, it was not natural science, it was something else in psychology. I can't remember which ones it was, but there were two, but one was far further inside the code quadrant than the other one. So it's quite a significant difference. Or your case, you kind of got the dispersal pattern, as it were. So you kind of got like one, sometimes they can be tighter, and sometimes, did you have any like that were really tight as opposed to really broad and kind of like a bit more of a splurge?
Can you ask the question again?
So when you've got your distribution patterns, you've got all your data points on on a plane, did you have any that were kind of like smaller groups? So I think of them like shotgun pellets or something. Does one choked off a bit more than the other? Was one more distributed than the other? Did you have anything that's quite contrasting
or
in terms
closer to the mean, perhaps?
Well, just how big a space did they take up? Was some quite big and others more kind of closer together on the plane? These data sets on the planes. I just go back to your slides with the planes on them.
Yeah, I'll make it then. I'll make it bigger. Oh no, this was there. Sorry, this was there. Ah, here.
Yes, we do have like, I mean, they're similar, but they're quite, there's definitely like the bottom two, there's a definite difference in the distribution of they're both like dominated by elite codes, but one is, you know, much tighter than the other.
But what I found interesting was that, like you said, it's dominated by elite codes, right? But you can still have some and which are in the lower code. That's interesting.
Oh yeah,
right?
yeah, no, absolutely.
So it's at least in my data, it's an outlier. But the interesting thing to know is that it's possible. It's fine. It was published. Right?
Yeah, and I think I've been saying since since very, very early on when I first started using planes. I'm just writing myself a note. That there will be multiple codes to be found in, say, a field, for example. So people will say, "Oh, this field is knowledge code." You think, well, actually, and then they get confused because they find certain instances of Noah code happenings going on, and you think, well, of course you do, because it is like I've said for a long time, it's like a big scatter pattern in a field or a journal or whatever it is you're looking at. It's quite often when you've got multiple instances, it's kind of, you've got this whole thing, and it can be dominated by one code with other instances that might be, for example, things that have certain purposes in a field or certain purposes in a journal, or it might be that it was a particular topic that allowed that to happen, or it might be that it slipped through the net thanks to really crappy editing practices at some point or something like that. There's so many reasons that that can happen, and it's really nice to be able to see that actually on a plane, because the plane's affordances have very rarely been used in terms of its capacity to deal with multiple codes, but multiple codes that are not evenly weighted. Right. So one is definitely dominant, then you've got some others. Often the outliers, as you call them, are ignored, and whereas they could be of interest. So I think this is great. This is really interesting. It shows you one of the ways in which we can. I mean, you could also do this qualitatively as well, obviously with a kind of a careful translation device in a similar sort of way. But it's a really amazing way in which to show the planes can do a lot more than just you know, having something over here and something over here and something over here and something over here. We can actually see that there may be very distinctive patterns. In the same way we get distinctive profiles, there may be very distinctive patterns on a plane.
I mean, the possibility of seeing these scatter patterns was something that excited me, really, because in the studies that I saw, I just saw like it's either this code or that code, but I thought that it really did not delve into all the possibilities you could have. Exactly what you said.
Yeah, well, I mean, planes have been rarely used to the full extent of their capacity. So I'm really I'm really happy to see this, because it's something then I can include in my writing about as well about planes, because I think planes have yet to be used to their full capacity. And it doesn't have to be necessarily quantitative, but it is really good to see multiple instances on the same plane. In terms of like being able to see then how tight that distribution is. Is Lee still here? No, she's had to. Is Lee still around? No, she's gone.
I think she's gone.
She may have been kicked off by load shedding South Africa, which can come and just throw people off the internet as well as get rid of their electricity. Anybody got any other thoughts?
I have a random thought.
Yeah.
I was interested in the name of the journals that you were sourcing, because it seems to me if they're both, you had two that were letters, is that right, Pavel?
Yes, I can, of course, show you the.
Only just thinking about how much interpersonal, social discourse is invited by it being a letter as opposed to it being,
So
it's the sort of thing that Darwin might have written to.
So a letter. So if we kind of look at where science journals are from, they were really first letters that were sent between gentlemen. Those were the people who had the time and the money to engage in science. And so some journals kind of kept that name. And what it usually means is that letters are shorter articles, like within 2, 3, or 5,000 words. But let me find.
And I guess once as you were sort of thinking about stylistics, once the style is set, that's inherited and endures. I'm just wondering.
I think what the scatter pattern really shows is that there is a variety of styles that are just fine to use. Can you still see the screen?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, great.
Yeah.
No, I didn't quite see your source at the beginning, and I was just wondering.
Right. But what I find interesting, and perhaps I didn't complete the idea, is because earth scientists will like to publish in more generalist journals, that there were several journals where both marine chemists and seismologists published.
Yeah.
And those would be like typically like these Earth and Planetary Science Letters. That's a journal which is rather generalist, and many specialists from earth science will publish there because they want their publications to have a broader impact and reach. Yeah.
Yeah, great to see those. Thank you.